This is Chapter 13, Supply Chain Management and Marketing Channels. So this is a image of the supply chain. The supply chain is extremely complex, but we're going to work on simplifying it and discussing it throughout this chapter and making it so that you can understand the benefits of why companies want to work with people within the supply chain and the benefits that it can have to consumers. So if you think about how a shirt gets to you as the consumer, right? It's an interesting process and something that you probably haven't thought much about before unless you're really considering going into supply chain as a concentration, which we do have now at USF. So a cotton shirt, for example, you're going to start with the raw materials from the cotton field, right? And then those go to the supplier, who is then going to actually make it into something that could be used to create a shirt, right? So just kind of one step further. And then it's going to go to the manufacturer, which is actually going to develop the shirt, okay? Put the label on it, all of those things. Then it'll be taken by truck or boat or plane or whatever by distribution into a store. And then ultimately you as the consumer can then purchase this shirt from the store. But there's a lot of steps that go into it and a lot of elements and a lot of communication that's really important to get things into the hands of consumers. Supply chain and supply chain management. So these are the formal definitions of supply chain and supply chain management. It's important to note that it's both internal and external to a company. And then supply chain management, the key words here have to do with seamless process and ultimately resulting in enhanced customer and economic value. It's important to understand that with the supply chain, everything takes time and money. Some of the parts of the supply chain are done in-house. Some are outsourced and are done externally, depending upon what expertise is needed, depending upon revenue. So there are options for this. Here is a list of benefits on why companies are interested in effective supply chain management. It can save companies a lot of money. And what a lot of this boils down to is that things are well organized and they are efficient. So there are lower inventory, transportation, warehousing, and packaging costs because you know everything that's going on. You're communicating with the raw material supplier, with the manufacturer, with everybody, and everybody's on the same page. There's greater logistical flexibility. So if something needs to be expanded, something needs to contract, something needs to go to a different area of the world, you can work better and more flexibly and more efficiently. Improved customer service. The book gives an example of Lennox, who produces air conditioning systems, and talks about how they had 2 centralized distribution centers in the United States. And they decided to decentralize and created 19 distribution centers. And what that did for the consumer is that it made it so that they received their products in less than 2 days, where before there was a much longer shipping time, there was more expensive costs. And because of that transition, their market share increased by 25%. So, not only did they see happier customers, but they saw higher revenues because of that. We're going to discuss supply chain integration. So supply chain orientation is a management vantage point, and it's practices having to do with the supply chain. So it's looking at it as a whole and essentially feeling that the overall performance of the supply chain as a whole is greater than the sum of its parts. So it's greater than each individual part of the supply chain. And so by utilizing supply chain integration, what you're doing is you're performing as a single unified system versus acting as an individual. So like the manufacturer, for example, they receive things for their raw supplies. They, work with, storage, distribution, all these other entities, and they need to look at things as a whole for the supply chain versus what's solely best for them. Some characteristics of leading supply chain oriented firms: they're credible. So they basically deliver what they promised they would do. They are benevolent. And what that means is that they accept short-term risks on behalf of the greater supply chain. And they also invest in other people's success, because working with other companies, you might need to invest in technology. You might need to bend a little bit based on a culture or management practice. So again, it's not a selfish, only looking at you as the manufacturer as the example. It's looking at the whole. And then cooperation. You're working with all of these other entities versus against. And then availability of support from top managers. That has to do with willing to do things in the short run that are going to be that might not benefit you, but they benefit the supply chain. And so you're looking at things from a long-term perspective for the view or for the success of the supply chain. And it's the same thing with efficiency and conducting and directing supply chain activity. You're looking at things from a long-run perspective. Demand-supply integration. This is a type of internal supply chain integration. And essentially what this means is that sales can make promises that can be kept. So if you are in sales and working for a company and you promise a particular product to a buyer, that it will be there when it will be there. I had a friend that worked for a company called Oneida, and they produce everything on the table. So plates and cups and forks and all those kind of things. And last year, they had some major supply chain issues, and he was really frustrated because he would sell things to these restaurants, to these large hotel chains, and thousands of plates or something. And then, lo and behold, the manufacturer wouldn't have even started producing them, but they weren't communicating with the salespeople. And so ultimately, he was constantly making these phone calls saying, I apologize, things are going to be coming soon. And what that led to was unhappy customers and a lack of repeat sales. So it's really important internally with a company to communicate and to know what's going on so that your salespeople can do the best possible job. Externally, we're going to talk about 5 types of external integrations that are sought by firms interested in providing top-level service to customers. So the first one is relationship integration. And this is a guide for 2 or more companies. So it's a conversation on how they're going to depend on one another. Measurement integration reflects performance and assessment. So it's how will we work with each other? How will we measure and be accountable for each other? And so with that, transparency is key. The next one is technology and planning integration. This has to do with making sure that you have IT and different systems in place that communicate, because if every single entity of the supply chain uses different programs and softwares and accounting, and they're going to have a really tough time working with one another. The next one is material and service supplier integration. And this has to do with streamlining processes to ultimately provide a good customer experience. And the way that you do that is by sharing the same vision and having the same responsibility for customer satisfaction. So it's not the blame game that it's, someone's fault. It's we're all in this together, and, we have the same goal. And then the last one is customer integration. And this is where each entity is basically assessing their own capabilities and comparing them to what the customer wants, because they want to be the best version of themselves. And so they're constantly seeing how they can be better and improve.